Good evening, everybody. I hope you can all see me and hear me okay. Lovely to be with you all once again on Wednesday for another chat with Matt, and this time it's episode 4 of our From Country Lad to Upstart Crow. We'll give it a few more minutes while people log in and things as usual before we get started. Just a couple of housekeeping things, actually. One is that I was asked a couple of questions, actually, last week. How can I ask you questions and chat in? So if you're on your laptop, you should see to the right of your screen a little bar with live chat, and in there you can log in and you can ask me any questions, make some comments. And the same feature should be on your tablets or smartphones. Should be at the bottom of the screen somewhere in there. There you go. Guildford Fringe Theatre Company said hello. Hi guys, how you doing? Nice to hear from you. Also, I had a question about the picture behind me. All those books can go. No. This actually is a newspaper. It's a cartoon from a newspaper. Cutting I found in a car boot sale, and if I put it a little bit closer, you might be able to see who it is. It's Richard Burton as Sir Toby Belch, and the wonderful Michael Hordern as Malvolio, and it's from the Old Vic production of 1954. Yeah, I found it in a car boot sale. There it is. You can see it a little bit closer. Ha! Fab stuff. Richard Burton apparently was unrecognisable in the role. There we go. Pop it back there before all those books fall over. So tonight we are talking about Shakespeare's entertainments. Hi, Chris. Hi, Jane. And the things that would have inspired him perhaps to start thinking about a world elsewhere, a world in the theatre. So these are the bits that we're going to look at tonight. We'll kick off with where we finished last week, actually, with him still in school. There's a couple of bits I didn't cover last week, so we're going to have a look at those. We're going to look at the Mummers plays, the mystery cycles, the pageants, the spectacle of the century, for Warwickshire anyway, in 1575. We'll come to that, and of course we'll come to all the players, the travelling players that would have come to Stratford-upon-Avon that he would have watched as a boy. Also, just to say that, in case I forget at the end, tomorrow is Shakespeare's birthday, and we will be celebrating with everybody around the world with a series of events, so online events. So if you have a little look after this, go to our website, go to the blog, and the latest blog on there that went up this afternoon has a programme of the things you can expect from us all through tomorrow, from 10 a.m. right through to 5 p.m. tomorrow. And please do share anything that you're doing about Shakespeare's birthday tomorrow with us as well. If you tag us in at Guildford Bard on Twitter or on Facebook or on Instagram, it's Guildford Shakespeare. And the RSC, the Royal Shakespeare Company, are doing a really big project called Share Your Shakespeare. So tag yourselves into that as well. So we all get sharing what we're all creating as we're celebrating the big man's 456th birthday. So let's get going with tonight's chat. Hello, Susan and Malcolm are with us as well. It's nice to see you. And Ellie, hello. Like I say, we're going to pick up where we left off last week, which is with Will in his schoolroom in Stratford at the King's New School on Church Street. Last week we discussed that the Greek and the Roman text that he was studying and the memorizing all those words, those phrases, the speaking of Latin in the playground, and the lessons that he would have had in the use of rhetoric and of memorizing, constructing arguments. We also touched on Elizabethan's love of sound and love of words and the sounds of words and the rhythms and the effect that those had on the listener. I was having a thumb through Peter Ackroyd's biography, Shakespeare, the biography, at the weekend, and in it he makes reference to a book by a historian called Bertram Leon Joseph. It's a book called Elizabethan Acting. And in it, he refers to a textbook which Elizabethan pupils, in which they were taught to pronounce everything audibly, leisurely, distinctly, and naturally, sounding especially at the last syllable, that each word may be fully understood, and that they utter every dialogue lively, as if they themselves were the persons which did speak in that dialogue. That's a direct quote from an Elizabethan textbook. And that first reference about sounding the last syllable is something that directors are forever reminding actors to think about when speaking verse, especially hitting the ends of lines, because that's where the sense of the line, the verse line, nearly always sits on the end. But also, it's incredibly important for speaking outdoors, which is what Shakespeare was doing as well in his later career. And for us, again, at GSC, making use of those last syllables of words or sounds of words is so important. How many times, you don't want to hear lines like upon my word to sound like upon my worm, which it can do in the open air, and that's no good for Benedict or Orlando or anybody really. So there's something genuinely real about that comment. That is something maybe Shakespeare took away with him if he had that textbook in school. We also spoke last week of Will growing up in an oral culture, that the Elizabethan England was an oral culture where the majority of things were listened to as opposed to read, and this meant that they were not only astute listeners, but also that orators, whether that's a player, a lawyer, a clerk, a singer, a market trader, they were all adept at using their own voices and, just as importantly, their memories. So remember, you can't write, not everybody can write things down, not everybody can read the things that have been written down. Now, at school, Will would have been learning swathes of Latin and Greek by heart, tested every Friday. And so his memory, and hundreds of his counterparts, would have an incredibly agile and robust memory. If you consider for a moment the professional actors that he would later come to work with, call his mates, they could at any one time have up to 30 plays rattling around in their head, which is an amazing number. Suddenly to say, right, next week we're doing Hamlet, and Burbage going, oh my God, Hamlet, can I remember that? But that's kind of how it would work, and they would have that immense resource in their heads. Ben Jonson declared that I can repeat whole books that I have read. So perhaps it's not such a fantastical thing to see where Will got his capacity for creativity. Before we leave school again, last week we touched also on the fact that the plays and performing would have been part of his education. Again, in Peter Ackroyd's book at the weekend, I noted that he mentions that at Shrewsbury Grammar School, boys were expected to perform one act of a comedy every Thursday. And at the King's School in Canterbury, where Christopher Marlowe went, they would do Christmas plays every year. In fact, I said, I think last week, two of Will's teachers, Cottam and Jenkins, they went to a school, they were under the tutelage of a man called Richard Mulcaster, and he had a firm belief on, he actively encouraged teaching through drama and the benefits of acting. And it's interesting that Peter Ackroyd makes a claim that drama was one of the bedrocks of Elizabethan education. If only we could say the same for our current Elizabethan education. But hey, that's another debate for another time. But of course, even if Will loved school and loved all his lectures and books and reading and all the rest of it, but there was still a lot of fun to be had, and there would have been entertainments that would have stimulated this young, fertile mind. And a feature of medieval life, still in Tudor England, still in Elizabethan England, in small towns and villages, would have been the mummers plays. Now, the mummers were amateur performances, if you like, of folk tales, things like Robin Hood or the Green Man would feature, or heroic ones like St. George and the Dragon. And I've actually, St. George and the Dragon features 10 times, is referenced 10 times in Shakespeare's plays. Richard III calls upon England's patron saint the morning of the Battle of Bosworth. He says, "Fair St. George, inspire us with the spleen of fiery dragons." And though Will refers to Robin Hood only 3 times, it's always with a tinge of, well, I think, sentimentality. Even Charles the Wrestler in the beginning of As You Like It refers to the Duke Senior, the exiled Duke, using Robin Hood. He says, "They say he is already in the forest of Arden, and many merry men with him. And there they live like the old Robin Hood of England. They say many young men flock to him every day and fleet the time carelessly as they did in the golden world." Robin Hood also crops up in the Two Gentlemen of Verona and Henry VI Part 2, in which he's joined by Will Scarlet and Little John. So again, these are all little bits of evidence that I'm saying that as part of Shakespeare's Will's growing up in this small rural town, he was watching the plays of Robin Hood, the plays of St. George and the Dragon. And the people performing these plays weren't professionals, as I said. These were your neighbours. These were the local townsmen and women. They were the local industries. So, and their names in other parts, mummers. There were mummers groups, and mummers were known colloquially around the country by different names. So you had things like plough jags or plough bullocks. And in Chiddingfold, in Surrey, just down the road from Guildford, they were called, or they were, and they still called, there's a group, they're still called the tit-tearers. And we've previously talked about Shakespeare's, or the Shakespeare's, the family Shakespeare, their neighbours being glovers and tailors and smiths and haberdashers, drapers, and so on and so forth. And his neighbours and his parents' neighbours are the cast of the rude mechanicals in A Midsummer Night's Dream. Bottom the weaver, Snout the tinker, Snug the joiner, Robin Starveling the tailor. On the one hand, what Shakespeare creates in Bottom and Quince and the rude mechanicals are wonderfully crafted scenes of their rehearsals and a parody of the rehearsals that his own theatre companies did. But also, on the other hand, these characters are filled with huge passion and zest for their hobby. So much so that they have to rehearse in secret, and when Bottom disappears and the play isn't going to go forward, they are completely distraught. You had not a man in all Athens able to discharge Pyramus, but he, bemoans Quince. No, he had simply the best wit of any handicraft man in all Athens, replies Flute. And though their performance completely falls apart, Shakespeare, their heart is always full. They always want to do some more. Even at the end, Bottom wants to sing a song and do a jig. And Theseus, rather than belittling them, actually, although the lovers have sort of made some satirical comments on the performances, Theseus at the end endows them with a nobility. He says, "The best in this kind are shadows, and the worst are no worse, if imagination amend them." And Will returns to that type of theatre, this sort of, if you like, amateur theatre. Again, at the end of his career, in The Two Noble Kinsmen. Here, there's a similar group of mechanicals. This time they're called countrymen, and they're led by a schoolmaster who's a bit pedantic, perhaps maybe based on one of his two schoolmasters who were taught by Richard Mulcaster in the arts of acting. I don't know. And they're trying to stage a plough play. That's what they refer it to. And I'd like to think that, even in his professional capacity throughout his career, he still remembered those Amdram shows of Robin Hood and the awe that his local neighbours gave every performance, as any of us give when we're in a show, whether we're paid or not. Or, when I was starting out doing Amdram and youth theatre and Worcester Operatic and Dramatic Society, the passion and the commitment that everybody put into it, it meant it was do or die. It was the show must go on, that kind of feeling. And I feel that's something that Shakespeare imbues those kind of characters with, of Dream and And in Love's Labour's Lost as well, the same pageant that they do at the end of the Worthies there. In a society that was governed by the seasons and by the church, lots of these events, these entertainment events, went hand in hand with some kind of festival. And in 1583, there's a record of a chap called Davy Jones, not he of Locker fame, but a chap from Stratford who was paid 13 shillings 4pence to put on a show, stage a show at Whitsuntide in Stratford. Now, interestingly, Davy Jones has a connection to Shakespeare. He's twice, in fact, because he marries twice. His first marriage is through Adrian Quinney, Adrian Quinney's daughter. Now, Adrian Quinney is the grandfather of Shakespeare's son-in-law, who will marry his daughter Judith. And then Davy Jones's second wife is a lady called Frances Hathaway, who is a first cousin of Anne Hathaway, Shakespeare's wife. So again, really tight community. The Two Gentlemen of Verona, thinking about these religious times or seasonal times of performing, the Two Gentlemen of Verona, Julia talks about performing at Pentecost, when all our pageants of delight were played. So pageants were another popular form of entertainment in Elizabethan towns and villages, and none more so than the great mystery cycles or morality plays. And one of the most famous mystery cycles was staged just down the road from Stratford at Coventry. Now, the mystery plays were very similar to to the mummers in the sense that they were performed by local people. They weren't performed by professionals, but they were far more organized. They had bigger budgets, and they were run by the very wealthy and the powerful guilds of towns. So the guild of silversmiths, or of tailors, or goldsmiths, or bakers, or they would take ownership of one particular part of the mystery cycle. And basically, the mystery cycles formed a series of 48 playlets, if you like, sort of vignettes, or slightly longer than vignettes, but and they were mystical, magical stories that told the story of the Bible from the point of creation right through to the final judgment. And they're called mystery plays because it was a mystical, the idea of that, of the book, the Old Testament was a mystery. It was magical. It was fantastical in the sense of the stories that took place. So you could see in one day the entire history of the world performed for you through song, tragedy, high comedy, grotesque humor, everything. And because they were closely tied to the old faith, they didn't last much longer after Shakespeare was born. In fact, Elizabeth's government closed them down in 1579, when Will was just 15. So he may have still had an opportunity to see these in Coventry. And after all, Coventry was the centre of the Midlands wool trade. So it was one of the larger cities, one of the larger towns in the country, and it was the centre of the Midlands from that point of view, much bigger than Birmingham, much more important than Birmingham at this time. And for a wool dealer, like his father was, illegal or not, and a worker in hides or for gloving, then it's almost certain that John, his dad, would have travelled there. And what child has never gone to work with their dad or their mum? So we can infer that probably Shakespeare went to Coventry with his dad, and perhaps what better time to go than to see when one of the mystery plays were on, an entertainment, because you could have left, John could have left his son while he's doing business watching one of the mystery plays, because the thing about the mystery plays is that you didn't have to see them in sequence. The idea around a mystery, in a way, they were sort of they could be done in any order. So you didn't have to sit and watch every one. You could dip in and dip out, kind of like a sort of immersive promenade performance. And I'll come on to that in a second, because I think that may have inspired Shakespeare in some way. But one of the biggest villains of the mystery plays was King Herod. And he's mentioned 4 times in Antony and Cleopatra alone. He's also mentioned in Hamlet and the Merry Wives of Windsor. And again, in his book, Peter Ackroyd, I noted at the weekend, he notes that the expression "all hail," which you would normally reserve for, greeting a dignitary, someone of higher status with deference, actually is also used by a number of villains and evil characters. So the witches, for example, all hail Macbeth. And in the mystery plays, Judas uses all hail to greet Jesus when he arrives in the garden, when he's going to betray him to the Romans. So, and let's keep with Macbeth for a second. We're just pulling out some threads here from mystery plays. Macbeth perhaps has the biggest connotation or connections to the mystery cycles, because it creates on stage one of the most attractive scenes, oddly enough, but the vision of hell and hell's mouth. And this is done in the Descent to Hell in the mystery plays, but here in Macbeth, it's the porter scene, the drunken porter at Hell Gate. His monologue: "I'll devil porter it no further," he says. "I had thought to have let in some of all professions that go the primrose way to the everlasting bonfire." Also, his history plays, both Roman and English history plays, have elements of the mysteries. The black humour of Richard III and Cassius, for example, and Julius Caesar, has echoes of the crucifixion scene in the York mysteries, which we still have written down. The Coventry mystery plays don't exist anymore in a full written form. And the comedy in these medieval plays, though, only serve to heighten the message and its significance in the same way that Shakespeare uses comedy to heighten the drama of the moment as well. What always strikes me as an actor working with Shakespeare is the way he grabs audiences' attentions from the word go. And let me give you an example. So in the first 4 scenes, let's say, of Richard III, one of his early plays, the lines that open each scene are: "Now is the winter of our discontent, made glorious summer by this son of York." Second scene: set down your honourable load, if honour may be shrouded in a hearse." Third scene: "Have patience, madam, there's no doubt his majesty will soon recover his accustomed health." Fourth scene: "Why looks your grace so heavily today?" "Oh," says the Duke of Clarence, "I have passed a miserable night." 4 lines that grab your attention straight away. What's going on? What's happened? And at the same time, there's onstage action with them. You've got a single figure on stage. Second scene, you've got people bringing on a hearse, followed by a mourning woman. Then third scene, you've got a worried queen being comforted that her husband may not recover his health. And then finally, "We're in a prison. Why looks your grace so heavily today? I've passed a miserable night." Why? Suddenly you're grabbed by what's going on next. And the scene beats within the scenes do exactly the same thing. Whenever a new character enters or a new idea is taken off, it's given like a headline. It asks the audience to, "Hey, wake up, come on, pay attention." And I just wonder if that energy and that movement is something that he took away from the mystery plays, in that sense that, like I say, you didn't have to sit and watch every one. You could watch this one for a bit, and then you could go, "Oh, there's a bit more laughter over there. I'm going to go and watch that one. Oh, I want to go and see this one." And you didn't have to watch them entirely from end to end. You could chop and change, come back. And I wonder, did Shakespeare enjoy that? Or did he kind of feel like, no, I want my audience to focus? And like a bit like a filmmaker. Today, Shakespeare guides us to where our attention, or where he wants our attention to be, and he holds us there. So I wonder if this had a sort of a different kind of impact on his writing as he continued in his career. Of course, whether he actually saw the Coventry Mystery Plays, we don't know. Just as we'll never know whether he saw the spectacle, what was probably the spectacle of the century in Warwickshire, at least, just down the road, the huge pageant at Kenilworth Castle. Now, Kenilworth is about 10 miles from Stratford, so nice and local, and the castle was the seat of Queen Elizabeth's favourite, the Earl of Robert Dudley. And she visited him there 4 times, and the final one lasted 19 days. She was there for 19 days, and this was in 1575. And basically, this was Dudley's biggest gamble, throw of the dice for Elizabeth's hand in marriage. This was his last chance to impress, and hopefully, I mean, there were so many rumors about the two of them. They were very, very close friends. So, there was lots of rumors. Had they slept together? Hadn't they slept together? Would she marry him? Wouldn't she marry him? The gamble sadly fails for him. But nevertheless, no expense was spared on this pageant. It was reported that the fireworks and the cannons could be heard 20 miles away. And Catherine Duncan Jones, in her book Ungentle Shakespeare, surmises that even if Will wasn't present, then he would have probably known someone who was involved in the pageant. Because when you think about it, a pageant, that's the events. They made a man-made lake called the Pond, but it was huge, and they had they recreated classical naval battles on it, and there were fountains, and there were fireworks, and there was singing and dancing. It was massive, and it lasted 19 days on and off, including hunting expeditions as well. So you would have had huge amounts of tradespeople building tents and rostra and staging and that artificial lake, boats to go on it. Enormous amounts of food and drink would have needed to be provided, and everything would have been brought in from Warwick, from Stratford, and all the other outlying towns to help service this enormous event. And it is often assumed that Will was there, and he did see some of it. And one day in particular, many scholars you'll read will say that he was there on the 18th of July, 1575. Basically, that day, Elizabeth had a day out hunting. And when she came back, Dudley surprised her with the sort of pièce de résistance, sort of spectacle of a pageant. And this was one of the eyewitnesses there. So she arrived at the lake and came there upon a swimming mermaid that from top to tail was 18 feet long. Triton, Neptune's blaster, who with his trumpet formed of a wrinkled whelk, Orion, that excellent and famous musician, riding aloft upon his old friend the dolphin. You get this idea of this huge spectacle taking place. In A Midsummer Night's Dream, which Shakespeare then writes about 20 years later, Oberon says to Puck, "Thou rememberest, since one I sat upon a promontory, and heard a mermaid on a dolphin's back utter such dulcet and harmonious breath, that the rude sea grew civil at her song, and certain stars shot madly from their spheres to hear the sea maid's music." As I said, for Dudley, all this elaborate courtship never ended in the hoped-for marriage, which is what something then later in this speech by Oberon, he goes on to say, "But I might see young Cupid's fiery shaft quenched in the chaste beams of the watery moon, and the imperial votress passed on in maiden meditation, fancy free," alluding to the fact that the imperial votress, Elizabeth, was not hit by the love arrow from Eros at this particular pageant where Orion was on a dolphin's back. Again, in her book, Ungentle Shakespeare, Catherine Duncan-Jones notes that the actor playing, I think this is quite fun, the actor playing Orion was reported during the pageant of standing up and reassuring the spectators that he was not Orion, but honest Harry Goldingham, which has a direct connection to Bottom in A Midsummer Night's Dream, where he reassures the mechanicals audience that don't worry, he's not really a lion, he's called Snug the Joiner. And I'm not Pyramus indeed, but I am Bottom the Weaver. And it's interesting that the first performance of A Midsummer Night's Dream would have been for probably some of the people who would have been at that pageant of 1575. The first performance of Dream was for Henry Carew, the Lord Hunsdon, who was the Lord Chamberlain for his granddaughter's wedding in 1596. And Lord Hunsdon, who was the Lord Chamberlain, was the Queen's cousin and half brother. So it's very possible that he and his family would have been at Kenilworth for this pageant. And Will's theatre company at that time, their patron is the Lord Chamberlain, the Lord Chamberlain's men. So it's really interesting how these things do, there's all this circumstantial evidence. We have no record of him being there, but there's so much circumstantial evidence to say, really, maybe, possibly, Orion on a dolphin's back is mentioned in Twelfth Night, and of course it could have just been a story told down the pub in the Bear Inn in Stratford and fell into folklore and, oh my God, Harry Goldingham, he only stood up and said his own name during the pageant, and it becomes part of something that his dad hears down the pub and his dad relays it back home when he goes home, and it sits with Shakespeare's memory, that capacious memory that he had. But before Robert Dudley, actually, there's one more connection with Kenilworth, which is I think worth note. Kenilworth had been lived in and owned by some of the most important people in English history, and perhaps none more so than John of Gaunt. John of Gaunt was the third son of Edward III, whose son, John of Gaunt's son, was Henry Bolingbroke, who became Henry VI. Henry IV, who deposed Richard II, and Richard II, and Henry IV, and Henry V, and Henry VI. That whole sort of 100-year history forms the bedrock of Shakespeare's first blockbusters in his writing career. And a lot of that stuff would have been, a lot of that history was from his doorstep. And he may have had a few personal connections to the story as well, because remember, I think I said in the second week, we're talking about Shakespeare's mum and dad and Mary Arden. The Ardens could possibly trace their family lineage back to Simon de Montfort in the 13th century, the 1200s, and who was the brother-in-law of Henry III, and Henry III had granted Simon de Montfort the custody of Kenilworth Castle. So, there's definite link. There are links. I'm not saying definite, sorry, I shouldn't say definite. You should never say definite in the world of Shakespeare. But there are links to his life and the stuff that he later feeds upon. But perhaps the entertainment that stuck in his mind most as a teenage boy were the visiting theatre companies. And we can only say that because that's what he ended up doing. So for the last bit of this evening, I'm just going to talk a little bit about those early companies who came to Stratford. It's a sign of how popular the act of theatre going became during Shakespeare's lifetime. When Shakespeare was born in 1564, there is no purpose-built theatre building in the country. By the time he dies, there are around 20 purpose-built theatres in London of different sizes and different shapes. There's no industry as he would come to know it. He starts his career at the same time as the theatre business that we know today, that I work in, that GSC works in, was also starting as well. they grew up together, which is it's fascinating. So before this point, theatrical life existed in the hands and the hearts and on the carts of the travelling players that toured the country or played in stately homes in landowners' houses for their patrons. So what was early show business like? Well, when a travelling company would arrive in town, they would usually go straight to the guild house, the guild hall. They would see the bailiff, the mayor, and they would seek permission, or they would say their patronage first of all, to make sure that they were not just a bunch of rogues and vagabonds, which if you didn't have patronage, that's what most players were treated as. And then they would seek permission to play. But before you could play publicly, you would have to do a private performance with the bailiff and the other councillors, the aldermen, to make sure that there was nothing scurrilous or seditious in what you were performing. And then if you were found to be sort of given the thumbs up by the corporation, the council, then you were allowed to go to the nearest inn, or they would recommend an inn to you, and you would go and set up for the day. If you were going to a smaller village or a smaller town where there wasn't such sort of a civic authority, let's say, on hand, they might announce their arrival with a trumpet, make their way to the nearest inn, do a little bit of haggling with the landowner, and then basically set up a makeshift stage using barrels from the inn and their cart. String a screen across the back, and that's your dressing room, and off we go. And once the players were set up, they would again take a horn or bell around the town to announce the start of the performance, and very slowly a crowd would gather. Now, if you're in a fairly decent sized town, you're in an inn with maybe galleried balconies around you to some of the rooms. So that's perhaps where the wealthier citizens may sit on stools or stand, leaning over. The rest of everybody else would be down in the yard on wooden benches. The serving benches would be now going around with wooden tankards, the ales flowing, foods being served, and the landlord is sporting a winning smile and rubbing his hands and thinking this is quite a good Saturday afternoon. Of course, you should point out that no one's actually paid to see a performance yet. The corporation hasn't said, yes, you can pour in our town, and here's a grant, here's some funding for you to pay to perform. They just gave you permission, and there was no sort of box office or anything. People turned up at the pub to watch the play. So the players devised really clever ways during their performance to say, well, before the spectacle comes out, so before maybe the big dragon's revealed, or the devil, or the villain, or the two lovers kiss, or whatever, they actually asked for money at that point to make sure that they got you there, you're sat down, and then they asked for them to put their hands in their pockets. There'd be jig, there'd be dancing, there'd be music, and the plays, they centered around things like, again, stories of the Green Man, Robin Hood. There would be religious, stories from various books of the Bible and so on. And the plays were much shorter than plays that we would end up being in the theatres. Either way, there was a lot of distraction and audience interaction, and this is what gave the players this distraction as well. And of course, there's a lot of drink going around, and that's what would give the players a bad reputation quite often, because they would end up being fights and raucous and all sorts of issues going on. Maybe we'll talk a little bit about that towards the end of the series, because actually violence in the theatre went hand in hand a lot. And at the time Will is growing up, these travelling players are starting to grow in number, as to the quality of the plays that they are performing. In 1569, Shakespeare's 5, the Stratford Corporation, of which his father is sitting on, allowed 2 companies that year to perform in the town. One was the Queen's Men, and one was the Earl of Worcester's men. Now, both have the Queen's Men were the troupe of the day, and Worcester's men have a little local connection because Stratford sits in the diocese of the Bishop of Worcester, so little connection there. And the shows that these companies would put on have would have an equivalent to today's sort of direct from the West End feel. They would be filled with music, song, tumbling, comedy, as well as story of adventure and intrigue. And the titles began to become fantastical and adventurous. Orestes, Grammar Girton's Needle, Gorbodoc, or Liberality and Prodigality. So, I mean, imagine the excitement of a small boy up close watching the energy of these actors and their world around them. And remember, if there's a lovely idea that maybe Shakespeare, may have sat with his dad in the private preview performance, in the Guildhall of a performance. You look at it. I mean, for me as a kid growing up, the title "All's Well That Ends Well," "The Tempest," "Much Ado About Nothing," "The Merchant of Venice." They're exotic titles. They're filled with mystery, the same as these were to young Will at his age. There's a contemporary account of a small boy experiencing the same thing, but not in Stratford, in Gloucester. And when he's grown up, he writes this. He says, "My father took me with him and me standing between his legs as he sat upon the benches. This sight took such impression in me that when I came towards Man Estate, it was as fresh in my memory as if I had seen it newly acted." And that's from an account in a chap called Edgar Fripp's book, Shakespeare, Man and Artist, written in 1938. Over the years, the main touring troops would visit Stratford, including Essex's men, Warwick's men, Oxford's men, repeat visits from Worcester's men and the Queen's men. Leicester's men came to Stratford in 1573, 1576, and 1587. And at that time, 1587, they were led by a man called James Burbage. Now, James Burbage would be the father of Richard Burbage, for whom Shakespeare would create the roles of King Lear and Hamlet and Macbeth and Othello and Prospero. And the Burbages actually had a local Stratford sort of ancestry as well. So, we're not going to go down the route in this episode of, is that where the first connection made? That's for another episode. But, the real pro-theatre stuff was knocking at Shakespeare's door in his late teenage years. Worcester's men, by the late 1580s, now they had the greatest actor of the time with them, Edward Allen. Now, that's the guy who Christopher Marlowe created Tamburlaine and Faustus for. So these big names would be coming to Stratford. And the acting style of these performers would have been markedly different from the mummers and the mystery guilds, tradesmen's performances of the mechanicals, if you like. There must have been a greater subtlety to these performances that Will came to be a part of. Hamlet remarks, famously, "Speak the speech, I pray you, as I pronounced it to you, trippingly on the tongue. But if you mouth it, as many of our players do, I had as life the town crier spoke my lines." In Coriolanus, Menenius tells two tribunes to look at their own faults before criticizing others, when he says, "When you are hearing a matter between party and party, if you chance to be pinched with colic, you make faces like mummers." So if Will was still at home at this time and had the yearnings of a creative life, this must have been like a manna from heaven to see these things, coming into this small rural town. The equivalent today of going to the cinema and 10 years later being awarded the Oscar for Best Screenplay. That's the speed at which this transformed, in Shakespeare's life. And the combination of all these stimulus, that we're discussing in all these evening talks, imbued with a sensitivity to the world around him and an appreciation of the art form of performance and theatre, and that theatricality. Hamlet calls the players the abstract and brief chronicles of our time. After your death, you were better have a bad epitaph than their ill report while you live, and in dream that the audience shall, by their show, the players' show, know all that you are like to know. Of course, How he ended up in the theatre, we'll never know. It is a mystery to this day. A tantalising one, nevertheless, and it's what will form one of our later episodes. It is possible, and we have to say it's possible, everything with Shakespeare is only possible in the broadest sense, that it was one of these West End companies that gave Will his big break. But that, as I say, is a story for another day. Episode 7, in fact, when we'll uncover what he did, or try to uncover what he did in the lost years, as they're known, when he disappears from Stratford and turns up in London. But before that, we've got another couple of episodes to go. Next week, we are going to be looking at the countryside that Will grew up in. So the birds, the bees, the trees, the flowers, the animals, the gardens, the orchards that are littered throughout Shakespeare's life. That natural world is something that rings out so clearly in every one of his plays, whether it's Macbeth, whether it's A Midsummer Night's Dream. Our next episode after that will be about Shakespeare's marriage, and then we're going to go episode 7, episode 7 will be about his the lost years, and episode 8, I was thinking at the end, if you want to email me in some questions, and we'll do a sort of a Q&A on episode 8 of the things that we've been talking about. So I'll repeat this again next week, but start to have a think about some questions. And then as they come in, I can do a little bit of research in the week after episode 7, and we can try and answer some for you. I will do my very best. Folks, it's been another pleasure chatting with you all tonight. Thank you so much. And little notice here that Elizabeth has sent in, the National Theatre at Home is streaming 12th Night tomorrow night from 7 p.m. with Tamsin Greig as Malvolio. So check on the National Theatre website tomorrow night for a bit of 12th Night, or what you will. All the way through the day tomorrow, we are looking at, we are doing stuff, as I said, for Shakespeare's birthday. So do have a look at our website. Keep tuned to social media. Stay home, stay safe, look after yourselves. And once again, folks, it's been a joy to chat with you this evening. See you all very soon. Bye-bye.